Oh. Excellent. Good. Can everybody see Sarah's screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
Excellent. So let me just take mine down so I can, oh, I've still got people coming in. I'm multitasking here. I'm opening the door. I'm clicking on the screen. So bear with me for a moment, but no, that's fine. I can do it. I'm a woman. I can do this, right? We girls are good at multitasking. Oh, here's another one. Okay, good. How exciting, right? Anyway, so Sarah, are we ready to start?
Yes, certainly.
Great. May I have the pleasure of introducing you, my friend?
Oh, that would be lovely. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Sarah and I have known each other for many, many years. I hate to think how many. I think we were small children when we first met, right, Sarah? It can't be that long.
Oh, yeah.
But over the years, we've developed a lovely friendship. We've shared many a very, very exciting moment, many moments of despair, and in between, just a lot of joyful times as part of the Friends of Lydiard. And it's just wonderful for me to introduce her today in her professional capacity as well as a friend. Sarah's extraordinary history with Lydiard goes back a couple of decades, dare I say. And originally, I'm sorry?
It's three.
Is it three? I didn't want to presume, Sarah. And you haven't changed a bit. But Sarah was formerly head of heritage at Swindon Borough Council, and of course was responsible for the extraordinary restoration to Lydiard House and Park and the return and conservation of so many of its contents. As keeper of the park, she initiated and led the incredible restoration of the landscapes and the gardens, and then, of course, the extraordinary project for Heritage Lottery Fund. Sarah is so inclusive of not just the Friends, but the wider community, and now the really wide community, because the work that we've been doing internationally for the Friends has had Sarah's magic touch in the background here. So I'm just thrilled to be working with her. We've got some extraordinary new projects ahead with Project Archive and some of the work that we'll be sharing with you as the year progresses. But today I'm really excited to see this presentation because I think there's going to be yet more discoveries that I have yet to see about Lydiard. It always has its surprises. So please welcome Sarah Finch-Crisp and Empty Corridors.
Liz, thank you very much indeed. And yes, I think you've probably made me blush, and was far too complimentary. This is a special period that I want to talk about today in the history of Lydiard House, and one that intrigues me and I think has intrigued many people over the years. And I suppose one could say that Lydiard Park has been incredibly fortunate in many ways. It escaped demolition, and so many houses after the war were in fact demolished across England and well, across Great Britain. But Lydiard escaped, and we do have to, I think, doff our caps here to David Murray John, the town clerk of Swindon Corporation as it was, who led the initiative to purchase the dilapidated mansion and 147 acres of parkland in 1943. This wasn't just an extraordinary initiative in terms of local authorities or in terms of the sort of practicalities of taking on the responsibility of the house and restoring it. But it was also something that conjured up for many people a lost or disappearing world that was surrounded with an element of romance and mystique to a certain extent. Now, in this talk, what I hope to do is briefly set out why the house had fallen into such poor condition by the time that World War II arrived. What had happened to the family, the St. Johns of Lydiard Park, that led to this quite obvious decline, and how their failing family fortunes impacted on the house itself. So, what happened? The St. John family, as many of you know, those of you who follow the Friends of Lydiard Park, have read some of the reports or some of our Tales of Lydiard that appear on the website, will be well aware that the St. John family were a very highly thought of family, had reached a zenith, if you like, in terms of their wealth, their court connections, and their standing in society during the 17th century and into the early 18th century. So a very prominent, well thought of family. Even going a little earlier back in time, they lived at Lydiard Park in a manner which enabled them to welcome and entertain Queen Elizabeth I in 1492. So this was a family of substance, landed gentry, and wealth. So what happened? I think we have to point the finger at the gentleman you can see in the picture on your left. This is where the problems really started. What Canon Khan described as succeeding heads of the family appear to have been set on a course of drift, which made the eventual sale of the house in 1943 inevitable. And Frederick, 2nd Viscount Bolingbroke, was the gentleman who really put the family on that drift, on course for the inevitable sale in 1943. He'd inherited a huge fortune, several properties, including the family's ancestral home at Lydiard Park, and he came into this money very young, but in not a very sensible fashion, for it seems that he had an enormous penchant for expenditure, for which he made some very poor decisions in terms of the family inheritance and family finances. His expenditure, well, we know a lot of it was on horses, and you can see, of course, the painting that's reproduced in the library at Lydiard Park of his favourite brood mare in the grounds of Lydiard Park. Well, keeping a stables both at Lydiard and at Newmarket was an expensive occupation, but we also know that he was an inveterate gambler. He had expensive tastes, he bought quantities of Sèvres porcelain and really lived the high life. In order to finance this, he started what became a family trait of mortgaging his estate, or various parts of his different estates, and creating attainders and or annuities rather. And as he did so, of course, the value of his properties decreased, and the rental income that was coming in from the land no longer matched the expenditure. This was something that continued through successive generations. And you may wonder why there's a little inset picture here showing the Queen and our late president of the Friends, Mr. Gerard Leighton. Well, it was a chance comment when she visited Lydiard House in, I think it was 1997. And Mr. Leighton actually said to Her Majesty, well, ma'am, of course, the St. Johns lost most of their money on the horses. And she quickly replied, well, what an easy thing that is to do. Which was very sort of sweet, but it was also very quick-witted at the time. If we move on to our next slide, we'll see where this steady decline took us. And I think are reminded of that wonderful piece of advice that Mr. Micawber gave to young Copperfield. Annual income £20, annual expenditure 19, 19 and 6. Result, happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20, 0 and 6. Result, misery. Well, I'm not suggesting that the family descended into a state of misery, but they certainly went into a grand decline in terms of their prestige. And certainly by the time you came to the tenure of the 5th Viscount Bolingbroke, seen here with his wife, Mary Emily Howard, as she had been, and their young son, Vernon, they were living in what you would call, for the aristocracy, straitened circumstances. Lydiard was mortgaged up to the hilt. Henry's ancestors had seen to it that the other properties at Battersea and at Purley had been dismantled and had been sold on. The family were no longer able to retain them. But there was a semblance of keeping up appearances, which must have been difficult. And I think there's no doubt that even within Swindon and amongst Lord Bolingbroke's own tenantry, there were quite a feeling that this was a family that was on its uppers, and really had perhaps a slightly dubious reputation, for which I think we can probably lay at the feet of the 5th Viscount here, but that is another story for another time. But keeping up appearances was something they did. And here you can see a rather charming picture of Lady Bolingbroke having tea on the lawn, probably around 1900. You can see there is still some semblance of upkeep here with the very sort of Victorian or Edwardian type bedding plants in front of the house. You have a footman coming out to serve tea. Lord Bolingbroke at this time, or just before, if we call this picture 1900, he died in 1899, was still being sent invitations to Buckingham Palace. He was a member of White's Club, where his ancestor Frederick had also been a member. He was Deputy Lieutenant of Wiltshire. So there were all the trappings, but actually very, very little hard cash there. So we're moving on a little bit in time, and I think these are some quite sort of poignant photographs, in fact, which show the house where Lady Bolingbroke, widowed, and her young son, as he grew up, Vernon, lived. These pictures I'm going to show you were taken in around 1930. At the time, the two were living there in relative isolation. We learned that there was a cook and a maid and a parlour maid, but there were no longer any male servants living in, as it were. A couple of gamekeepers, 2 or 3 labourers, but really for the type of, the number of staff that once would have been at Lydiard, this was very reduced circumstances. Here we have a picture of the, I think, actually I'll go back one because I think we've lost one. Here we have a picture of the main hall. They called it the billiard room at that time. And it does look a bit run down, doesn't it? So we've got this massive table in the great reception room. On the right, I think you can see a glass case on the console table. I'm pretty certain that was a very large stuffed pike, which was rather a prized possession of the family in the early 19th century. It had been caught in the lake at Lydiard, and some other stuffed birds, possibly sitting on top of a piano. I'm not entirely sure. But we do know that around the period of the First World War, that Vernon and his mother, Lady Bolingbroke, were living mostly in the service wing, with these rooms packed up. Presumably they were too expensive to heat, and they were extremely dilapidated. And Vernon was known to spend many hours in the drawing room on his own, playing the piano. Jumping back again, this is a picture of the library. No longer grand furniture. Probably most of that had been sold off in the 1820s after the death of the 3rd Viscount Bolingbroke. But it is interesting to note in this picture of the dining room, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but these two large canvases on the wall here, these are almost certainly paintings by George Stubbs. Frederick, the racehorse owner, was the earliest great patron of George Stubbs, and the family owned several, I think it was up to 6 pictures at one time that were painted by Stubbs. And you may think, well, how is a family on its beam ends when the walls are still hung with paintings by Stubbs? But in the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, there was really very little value attached to Stubbs's paintings. And in fact, one of the few things that Lord Bolingbroke Vernon inherited when the house was sold were, or rather when his mother died, forgive me, were the picture collection, and which he endeavoured to sell. And the Stubbs paintings went for a matter of a few £100s. It would be a very, very different story today. Whoops. Sorry. So, moving on, we have this rather dilapidated view of the back of the house. As I said, Vernon and his mother had retired to the service quarters, which is the 19th century wing of the house as we know it today. And the house was becoming infested with dry rot, death watch beetle, woodworm, you name it. So a poor state. In 1940, Lady Bolingbroke died, and believe it or not, the gross value of her remaining estate at Lydiard Park was just under £16,500, very little. And her net personal estate was a mere £1,036. I think that tells quite a story. So Vernon inherited really nothing at all apart from the picture collection and some family ephemera. The estate was sold by Lady Bolingbroke's executors, and Vernon took himself off down the drive to Brook Cottage. Lydiard Park was expected to be requisitioned by the military. And here we see a plan which I find very, very intriguing. It belongs in the house collection at Lydiard, and in the bottom right-hand corner, if you can just about make out that it's a plan of the vacant house, and we've got the name Lieutenant Colonel at the bottom, and 1941. So this plan was almost certainly done by the military with a view to requisitioning the house. But of course, one of the great areas of interest to us now is its labelling of the servants' quarters, much of which have either been changed or demolished since that time. So we can see here, if you, I don't know how well you can make it out, but we have a still room, we have a larder, we have a large kitchen, servants' hall, shoe room. Over here, a gun room. And in fact, Lady Bolingbroke became increasingly ill towards the end of her life, but one of the things that she did make an effort for was the occasional shoot, which was attended by her farming tenants on the estate. There's a washroom, a drying room, a dairy courtyard. So all the signs of what once would have been an absolute hive of activity at Lydiard Park. It really conjures up, I think, the bustle of life that once must have existed there. However, the military came along, and on further inspection, closer inspection, they came to the conclusion this wasn't for them. In fact, their exact words were, "It isn't fit for human habitation." So the house was rejected. And I think from some of those earlier photographs, you could see exactly why. So what was going to happen? This was a very, very precarious period in terms of the house's history. Very, very vulnerable. Even the military didn't want the house. It was up for sale. The executors of Lady Bolingbroke There was no way that anything could happen other than the fact that it was put on the market and most likely become demolished in the inevitable development of post-war Britain. But we know that David Murray John, the town clerk of Swindon, really had the most amazing initiative to save it for the town, for the people of Swindon, and that it would provide a place of culture and education and recreation after the war. So he really did go out on a limb in acquiring the house and the surrounding parkland for the mere sum of £4,500. So what an incredible investment, but really a very, very brave move at that time. Now, David Murray John, having bought what many considered a huge white elephant, spent quite a considerable effort politely but persistently lobbying government, lobbying the Ministry of Works in order to see if he could access any funds for restoring the property after the war. And it became something, I would say, due particularly to his persistence, something of a national example. It certainly came to national notice in a way that very many houses didn't at this time. Oh, I should go back and just mention, we were talking about the service quarters, and here you can see in this early picture of the north wing of the house, the service wing, this large wall which was put there to obscure the kitchens and servants' hall from the courtyard. That was subsequently demolished by Swindon Corporation. So the military didn't want the house, but they were interested in the parkland. And of course, the area which we now know as the sports and events field were taken over, and a military camp or hospital camp, the 103rd Hospital Camp, was established in anticipation of D-Day casualties, specifically for the 101st Airborne Division. And this is an early photograph taken off the camp. It must have been very intriguing for many of those GIs stationed at Lydiard to have this rather mysterious, stately home so close to them, all closed up, empty. And we do know that temptation perhaps overcame any caution they might have. And in November 1943, a group of patients, obviously feeling fairly robust, broke into the house and did some petty damage, nothing huge, knocked some knobs off the banisters, broke into the attic and helpfully inscribed their names in the attic ceilings and on the lead of the roof. They also tolled the bell in the house, the service bell, which must have caused a little bit of a consternation as it echoed over the fields across Lydiard Tregoes and Hook and Lydiard Millicent, as that was the sign for the invasion. Unfortunately, they also got into the church and stole the communion wine. This didn't go down terribly well, and there was a service the following Sunday in which every member of the camp was duly marched to church in an act of penance. But I think this is really what alerted Swindon Corporation to the fact that they couldn't leave Lydiard House completely on its own. It was no good just locking the door and leaving it. Something had to be done. And that something was to employ a caretaker. And the gentleman who was found, who you can see in the picture on the left, and also sitting down in the picture on the right, was Mr. Harold Goff, a local man. For some years, he'd been and remained the verger of St. Mary's Church. And he moved in with his wife and family, including his daughter, Joyce, who became Joyce Vincent. You can see her in the picture on the right. And extraordinary, really, that they lived in such primitive conditions in a house that was desolate, right next to the military hospital camp. So quite extraordinary circumstances, I think. And I'm delighted that we're actually going to be able to listen to some words that Joyce spoke on a radio interview some years ago. Sadly, she's not with us anymore. But she recollects what it was like to move into Lydiard House in 1944.
Now, Joyce has very fond memories of living at Lydiard House, but as a teenager, when she first went to live there with her parents, her feelings were very different.
I thought my father was the most cruel man on earth to think of taking us there, because there were no conveniences. We had candles, Aladdin lamps and oil lamps, and my mother cooked on what was known as a triplex fireplace. You had your log fire or coal and the oven at the side. But the first night we stayed there, my brother and sister-in-law decided they would stay as company. And there was my parents, my sister, myself, and my brother and his wife. And our bedrooms were, I would believe, what used to be the servants' quarters, where you went up 2 flights of stairs and down a flight and long landing. The bedrooms led off of these. And at some time or other, in each bedroom had a fireplace, and at some time or other, they had been blocked in with wood fitted to, to stop the rooks and crows, I imagine, coming down a chimney. But we'd all been in bed about a quarter of an hour, and there was an almighty bang. Everyone was out on the landing before you could almost say anything. And what had happened, one of these pieces of board had fallen down in the bedroom that my brother and sister-in-law were sleeping in, and had hit the iron bar on the bed. That was very frightening, very, very frightening. And it was a question, again, there's no one when to go upstairs or downstairs. No one wanted to be first and no one wanted to be last. We all wanted to be in the middle. After that, really, it took a little while, but after that, I never, ever felt frightened or nervous there.
What sort of physical state was the house in?
Oh, upstairs was in terrible state. Downstairs, not too bad. But I don't think there was a bedroom ceiling upstairs which didn't have a huge hole in it somewhere. You could look through and look right up into the attic.
Harry.
It's lovely to hear those words from the past, and I'm going to lead on from there to an extract from an article that the architect Sir Hugh Casson wrote about Lydiard Park. Well, in fact, it was part of a BBC broadcast, home service broadcast in 1953. It's an absolutely wonderful article, and I do recommend you go to report number 4 of the Journals of the Friends of Lydiard House if you'd like to read it in full. But picking up Joyce's point about the ceilings and the roof and the difficulties that were there and the roof caving in, he says, in the attics, nature and architecture had become almost indistinguishable. Here in the dark, where the bats swooped and bumped and the wind hissed gently through the slipping tiles, it was like standing in some mountain forest. Above my head were knotted the huge crooked timbers, eaten away by age, shaken by storm, but still for the most part sturdy and serviceable. At my feet, a massive great lead-lined gutter threaded its clumsy way across the ceiling rafters, carpeted with the twigs of the jackdaw's nests. I think that really gives you a sense of just what a state the building was in. But it also gives you that sort of flavour of romance that we begin to hear from various other voices.
Now Joyce has
but
very
not that
fond
one.
memories. Now Joyce has very fond memories. But as a teenager, now when Joyce has very fond with her parents living at Lydiard House.
Sorry about that. We'll have to cut that bit for the recording, won't we? Now, hopefully you can all see with me the next slide where we have a portrait of the architectural historian Christopher Hussey, and a wonderful image from Country Life magazine in 1948. Now, Christopher Hussey really brought, and I think, brought the attention of Lydiard Park to a very wide public, the sort of people who were very interested in the architecture, the history, the interior decoration of Britain's ancestral homes. But his article wasn't just factual. There was something about it that really caught people's imagination. He definitely introduced that idea of romance, of a lost world. The article is positively lyrical about the beauty of the house. It also dwells on, if you like, the desolation and the abandonment. And it encouraged, this particular article, we know because so many people referred back to it, encouraged both writers, poets, artists to take up the cause of Lydiard and to become interested in it, and in many cases visit it themselves. The artist Piper, we've already talked about Sir Hugh Casson, but also Aldous Huxley. If we look at the next slide, we can see that Huxley wrote an article, in fact it was for the Ford Motor Company Journal in 1951, A Tour Through Time. And here Huxley really laments the disappearing world of the landed gentry, and his concerns about what was going to happen to these places post-war and the losses that was going to occur because of it. And I'm going to read you a passage from that article. And once again, it's really worthwhile reading the whole article because it's so beautifully written and so captures what many people felt about these buildings at the time. He writes, "From outside, everything seems to be as if it were under George II, as successive St. Johns imagined it always would be. But within, all is desolation. The silence of the cold and empty house reverberates with a more poignant expression the same perennial commonplaces as had forced themselves upon us in the church." He'd also written beautifully about the church. "The roof leaks. The ceilings, with their delicate Italian plasterwork, have begun to disintegrate. The paint is peeling. The wallpapers are blotched and leprous with damp. In the library, in the great drawing rooms, in her ladyship's boudoir, there's a sepulchral smell of mildew and dry rot. The glory is departed." So here you can start to sense this feeling of potential loss. Times are changing. Things aren't going to be the same again. Now, this article was illustrated by a Canadian war artist. I'm afraid I haven't got a picture of him in civvies, but here we have a picture of George Campbell Tinning. And this particular picture you can see here of the dining room didn't appear in the article, but it was obviously done at that time in 1951, showing the empty rooms. And I just think they're so evocative. And I think you can start to see why people perhaps felt even more perhaps connected with Lydiard when it didn't have its furnishings, when it felt so vulnerable, where you almost felt the echo of footsteps long gone, long disappeared. But a really beautiful watercolour. Whoops. Here we have another one, this time of the hall, and again, not one that appeared in the article. And perhaps that's why that both these two pictures appeared together a few years ago. I think it was 2012, and had become separated from those that appeared in the journal. and Lydiard House, the museum, were able to purchase them with help from the Art Fund and the Friends of Lydiard Park. I think we in fact paid for the framing of the pictures, and if you'd ever like to see them, they're hanging in the entrance hall or the side entrance hall of Lydiard Park. But here, as you see, you've got the hall, and then on the left, one of these beautiful photographs from Christopher Huss's Country Life article of 1948. So it's some years that the house is continuing in this sort of in-between state, this empty state. And it was going to be a year or so before building work really got going in the house to restore it and eventually open it to the public in 1955. Incidentally, in this article, which you can see an extract of here, there were two wonderful watercolours of St Mary's Church as well, and it would be marvellous if one day we could try and trace these. But here you can see distinctly, again, a wonderful country life photograph. And for those of you who don't know, the main staircase behind the main hall at Lydiard House, this shows it beautifully. And there, in both photograph and picture, you have the small baize door that leads to the corridor that runs round the back of the state rooms. So a service corridor. Right, so a romance with Lydiard House that had touched very many people. So let's go back to that world of the late 19th century, which Huxley was mourning. He called it the Victorian compromise, when the landed gentry no longer had the wealth and perhaps the status they once had. You had the burgeoning business and middle classes. But the old way of life was still allowed to coexist, simply not just so dominant. So we're going back to this picture, which shows St Mary's Church and the back of Lydiard House, because it's one of the very few photographs from this time, which even gives you an indication of the service wing in the house and the parts of it which were demolished. Sorry, my apologies. So if you look at the two ladies standing just by the little wooden gate, you can see an entrance there which went into one of the courtyards behind the house. And to the right of that, as we saw on that 1941 plan, there were quite extensive service rooms, not just the 19th century wing that we know today, but those additional rooms that disappeared when the modern day conference centre was built in their place. So this is a glimpse into that bygone world, and I think I'm going to read to you now just another little extract from Hugh Casson, because he does also give us an idea about these service apartments or rooms, which is very, very atmospheric. So if I haven't lost my place, I will find that again for you now. Here we are. Behind these elegant rooms lie the service quarters, long stone-flagged passages strung with ancient bell wires, cavernous pantries and still rooms, larders as vaulted and ice-cold as castle dungeons, stone sinks as big as horse troughs, and in the middle of all this, as far as the dining room as you could possibly be, the kitchen. What a kitchen. A real pantomime giant's affair with everything to a mammoth scale. A monstrous range, a griller big enough to roast an ox, the remains of a dresser which must have been designed to take dishes the size of motor tyres. Rows of hooks for hams mounted almost to the smoke-blackened ceiling, 25 feet or so above the stone-flagged floor. It's just an amazing image and glimpse into that lost world, which was just about still operating when this photograph was taken. So here we have another photograph of the very dilapidated back of the house, really quite ruinous, and set against this beautiful interior, which, although some of it was damaged, an awful lot was left intact. And I think one of the things that attracted people so much was that the rooms had been in a virtual time capsule. The St. John family, owing to their running out of money during the late 18th and largely through the 19th century, early 20th century, really very little had been done to the house. So you hadn't had many of the Victorian interventions like heating, running water, electricity. None of these things had been introduced. The last decoration, as far as we know, was done in 1824 after the death of George Richard, the third Viscount Bolingbroke, when the flock wallpaper that many of you would recognise, the red flock wallpaper in the drawing room and state bedroom, was put up. The house had been tarted up for tenants after his death. But really that's well over 100 years, well, a lot more, since the last redecoration. So it must have been a very strange place to be living for the late Lady Bolingbroke and her son Vernon. But it's alluring, it's exquisite, it's desolate, and I think it seems to sort of wave its magic wand over an awful lot of people. Some of the readings or some of the articles that have been written about it are, as I said before, incredibly lyrical. Others are more down to earth and factual. And in fact, we do have an account from Mr. Rose, the caretaker, who took up offices at Lydiard Park following Mr. Gough and Mr. Lancaster's departure. In older age, he reflected on what he saw when he first came to Lydiard Park, because he was very conscious that it had long gone, that it had disappeared. So let me just find that article for you. Here we go. Yes, he mentions the area where, let's have a look. Find this for you. Yes, he does talk about, he wants to write about what Lydiard Park looked like, and describes the monstrosity of the modern accommodation wing that was more suited to, as he says, a concrete jungle than a Georgian building. And he describes the courtyard areas that have now disappeared. Courtyard was used for a variety of purposes. On the right was a large barn for storing hay, slated but with no front. At the end of the barn were 2 or 3 separate buildings, each with slated roofs and with doors that could be fastened. One of these was used for rearing pheasants, another was a pigsty. One small stone building seems to have been used for farrowing. There were remains of other buildings showing that the courtyard had been put to good use. There were even the remains of an outdoor boiler, probably used for boiling up linseed for the horses. It's a fascinating lost world, isn't it? And of course, during the war, there was rationing of supplies, people weren't taking photographs. So were it not for the country life pictures, in many cases we would have no view of Lydiard at this time at all. But sadly, nobody thought to take photographs of those kitchen areas of the house, of the sculleries, of the larders. There are just 1 or 2 pictures still remaining, which sadly, due to COVID, I couldn't show you tonight because they weren't accessible. But I think there were many people who really wondered whether Swindon Corporation, having bought Lydiard Park, would ever be able to do anything with it. They admired the initiative, but really this was a huge liability, and how on earth was a local authority going to pay for it and how to run it in the future? And this concern was echoed by many people. and clearly, as we know now, they underestimated Swindon Corporation. There's one more, if we've just got time, one more little reading that I would like to share with you, if I may. And this was from, I don't know if any of you have come across this book. It's No Voice from the Hall, the early memoirs of a country house snooper, John Harris. I haven't quoted from it extensively because he is liable to be a little bit supercilious and snooty in his attitude, but, and forgive me, John Harris, for saying so, it was the time. But he wrote an essay called For Aquascutum Overcoat, Read Army Issue, and I'll leave you to follow that up if you ever feel like it. But this particular passage I would like to read. What would the borough of Swindon do to the place? I felt deflated by the thought. The atmosphere of the house was so redolent of the St. John possession, such a powerful condensation of magic. Surely it could never survive. Happily, it has, and I'm just delighted to include in this slide just a little image of the same view of the back of the house, which has only very recently received new coatings of lime wash and rendering repairs to keep it in good condition for another decade or so. So my final slide, and two similar but contrasting views of Lydiard House. To my mind, it's the black and white view which actually seems the most romantic and alluring, and perhaps that is just what black and white film does. You can see at that stage the council hadn't put in the replacement Georgian windows, and it still had its large Victorian plates. But in other ways, so little changed from the image that we see today of Lydiard looking well kept and beautiful as always. And here we have Sir Hugh Casson saying, from the time the house was left, so to speak, for dead, and yet, unlike more recently deserted houses of its kind, there is no atmosphere of sadness or self-pity here. The house has kept its self-respect and is being rewarded by the prospect of another century or so of useful life. And I think I will leave it there, if I may. There's so much more that could be said and shared, but I think one can't do better than leave you with Hugh Casson's words. So thank you very much for listening.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful, fascinating talk. Certainly some pictures I hadn't seen before and some stories, so thank you for sharing that. We did have a question actually from Angela, who asked if the full Huxley article is available somewhere.
That's a very good question, actually. I have a piece that I've printed off here, but I think what we will ensure that we do as part of our project archive is ensure.
Oh. Sarah, you just muted there. Hang on.
I do beg your pardon. Was that all muted? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Angela, you asked about the article A Tour Through Time by Huxley. I'm not sure if you can pull it off the internet anywhere, but what we will do, we will make sure as part of Project Archive that it's loaded into our digital portal so that later this year it will be accessible to people.
I did know about that connection. I came up to the house, so it may have been before all this rubbish, COVID, I mean, and one of your staff, he was giving me the guided tour, but I was so busy being cross about something that I wasn't really taking it on board, so I need to get him to do it again. But it showed me those watercolours, and I just thought that was a lovely connection between those, you know, and Aldous Huxley and Lydiard House and stuff. And I just thought that was really, really nice. And I thought they were lovely paintings as well. I really like those watercolours.
They're beautiful paintings. I should add that I'm no longer at Lydiard House. I left a very long time ago in 2008, but I know that they have some excellent guides there, and I'm really glad that they're pointing out those watercolours.
Oh, Adrian, he's really good. Yeah. So I was busy being cross about something and not really taking any of it in. So I need to do it again with him sometime.
Okay. Yes. No, I thoroughly recommend some of these articles, and Hugh Casson's is absolutely beautiful. And in terms of the Christopher Hussey articles, he wrote on both the church and the house, 1947 and 1948. And in fact, Swindon Corporation printed off numerous, or had Country Life print off numerous copies. I think they were delighted to see that profile had been given to Lydia, but no doubt thanks to David Murray John yet again.
Sarah, Katie has raised her hand for a question. Katie?
Well, the good news from Lydia tonight is it's all looking lovely. I've just walked up there, and thank you for the talk. And I just wondered if you can, if we can get hold of a picture of that horse from a Stubbs. Who owns the picture now?
The Stubbs painting is in a private collection, and we do have an image of it. I think you will be able to see it on our website. So there are images floating around, and of course in the library at Lydiard Park a reproduction was made some years ago, so that it is actually sitting in its original spot above the bust of Bolingbroke in the library. But it was one of several, Katie, and two were actually painted of his horses at Lydiard Park. So the Stubbs one, the brood mare that you saw in the talk, also a group of mares and foals as well.
It's really interesting, their connection with the local racing, considering that it's such an area of racing around here, and it would be nice to be able to get hold of an image of it, other than having to pirate it off the internet, obviously.
Well, anyway, I'm sure I can slip you one.
Very good.
Anybody else have any other questions?
Any more questions?
Yeah. Well, Sarah, I think a lot of the resources that you shared in your presentation will be available through Project Archive, right? Which will hopefully be sending out some information on to the Friends in the coming months. So we can all pore over those gorgeous photographs some more.
So lovely, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see everybody here tonight. It's so nice to see your faces.
Is it okay? I took the liberty of screenshotting 2 or 3 of the slides just to use on social media, but I'll only do that if that's okay.
Yeah, I don't suppose you've picked up a copyright there on your particular slides, but I'm sure that's fine. Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like you're not using it for commercial value. It's generally not a problem.
Excellent. And Sarah, next talks coming up, they're on the website, correct? We have a more series continuing.
Super talks coming up. In April, Margie Hoffman, who is a highly experienced horticulturalist and works for the Gardens Trust, or the Historic Gardens Trust, is giving us a talk about garden visiting. She's a really good speaker, and she brings out all the fun and history of why people visit gardens and how they've done that over the centuries. So I think that's going to be a really, really interesting and entertaining talk. And after that, we have our own Linda Pigeon, or have I got this the wrong way around? Do you forgive me, because I haven't put it out in front of me. Wrong way round. Okay, so next talk, Margaret Beaufort by Linda Pidgeon, will be fascinating. Yes, not to miss. And then we have Margie Huffnam the following month, and then we will be talking to Frances about her forthcoming book on the ladies of Lydiard. So do keep watching the website and your news bulletins and sign up for the next talks. We'd love to see you, and do bring along anyone else who you think might be interested.
Okay, that was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Wonderful. Lovely to see you all. Okay. Bye-bye then.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Get out of these things. Get in them and I can't get out of them.